Tonight we step carefully into a story that was never meant to be told out loud, a story that hums beneath your world like a low, distant engine, always running, rarely seen. Tonight we speak of Tartarian elites and the formation of hidden power classes, not as an argument, not as a lecture, but as a slow walk through half-lit corridors of memory, where dust settles thickest on the most important things. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison. And while that idea may sound extreme, you notice how often power prefers enclosure, prefers walls without visible gates, prefers systems that feel natural rather than imposed. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. And as you settle in, you might post your local location and the time you are listening, because power, after all, always cares where you are and when. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You're standing over an old map. Not a clean one, not a digital one that can be zoomed and corrected at will, but a heavy, creased sheet of parchment. It smells faintly of iron ink and smoke. Your finger traces a vast territory labelled simply Tartary. The name feels heavy, almost too large for the page, and yet you know something unsettling. This name will disappear. It will be rubbed away, relabeled, broken into smaller, safer pieces, and you ask yourself, quietly, why do empires vanish first on paper before they vanish in memory? You begin to notice a pattern. Power does not always fall with fire and noise. Sometimes it dissolves softly, like salt in water. The Tartarian elites, as whispered in fragmented accounts, do not scream their authority. They redistribute it. They refine it. They let it flow into channels where it no longer looks like rule, but looks like tradition, expertise, or necessity. And as you walk deeper into this story, you realize you are not being shown an empire. You are being shown a method. Maps, you see, are not neutral. They never were. A map does not only show land, it teaches you what matters. What is named is acknowledged. What is unnamed becomes empty, available, forgettable. When Tartary fades from cartography, it does not mean the people vanish overnight. It means the story about who holds legitimacy begins to change, and elites, the quiet ones, understand this better than soldiers ever could. You imagine the Tartarian ruling classes not as a single crown or throne, but as overlapping circles, merchant families who control trade routes, priest-scholars who control calendars and law, engineers who control water and roads. None of them rule alone. Together, they create a fabric so dense it feels like reality itself. And when that fabric is later cut and resewn under new names, the hands doing the sewing remain curiously familiar. You feel the strangeness of it in your chest. How can power survive without banners? How can elites persist without visible crowns? Yet you already know the answer. Because you live inside a world shaped the same way. The most enduring authority is the kind that convinces you it is simply how things are. As you drift further, the map beneath your hand begins to blur into other images, ledgers, treaties, censuses. You realize that Tartary, whatever it truly was, functioned as a vast coordination system. Goods moved smoothly, knowledge was standardized, measurements aligned, time itself, days, months, rituals was regulated. And regulation, you begin to sense, is power's favorite lullaby. It puts resistance to sleep. The elites who thrived in such a system did not need to announce themselves. They embedded their influence into procedures. If you controlled the calendar, you controlled agriculture, taxation and worship. If you controlled trade nodes, you controlled survival. If you controlled records, names, births, land, you controlled memory. And memory, once shaped, becomes destiny. You ask yourself, in the quiet way one asks dangerous questions before sleep, when Tartary vanished from maps, did its elites vanish too, or did they simply migrate into new roles, wearing new languages, pledging loyalty to new flags while preserving old techniques? The story does not answer directly. It never does. Instead, it offers patterns and invites you to recognize them. You think of how modern power feels impersonal, a form denied, a credit approved, a border crossed or refused. No king speaks to you, no priest condemns you aloud, yet the decision stands. Somewhere someone or something has already decided, and just like that you feel the echo of ancient systems humming inside modern ones. The Tartarian elites, according to the whispers, understood something essential about human nature. People resist chains, but they embrace systems. People fear tyrants, but they trust experts. So power learned to address itself as administration. It learned to speak softly. It learned to hide behind necessity. And once that lesson was learned, it could be passed down endlessly, even as names and nations changed. As your eyes grow heavier, the map finally folds itself away. You are no longer looking at Tartary as a place. You are feeling it as a template, a way of organizing humans so efficiently that rebellion feels irrational, even unthinkable. And you wonder, was Tartary erased because it failed, or because it succeeded too well? The question lingers, unanswered, like a candle left burning in an empty room. You sense that this is only the first door. Beyond it wait stories of wealth, bloodlines, rituals, and quiet agreements made in ink rather than blood. But for now, you rest with this single unsettling idea that the most powerful elites are not remembered as rulers at all, but as editors of reality. And as sleep draws closer, you allow that thought to settle gently, like dust returning to an old map, waiting for someone brave or tired enough to look again. You move on without noticing a clear break because power rarely announces chapter changes. The map has folded away, but its logic remains in your hands, and now those hands are dusted with something finer than ink. Silk, salt, grain. You follow them instinctively, like an animal following a scent trail in the dark. These are not luxuries at first glance, they are necessities, and that is precisely why they matter. Silk slides through your imagination first, soft and luminous, catching candlelight as it passes from one pair of fingers to another. It is beautiful, yes, but more importantly, it is controlled. You begin to see that Tartarian elites did not hoard gold the way stories suggest. They positioned themselves upstream from need. They learned that whoever controls what must move will eventually control those who cannot live without movement. Salt follows close behind, white, unassuming, almost invisible once dissolved. Yet without it, bodies weaken, food spoils, armies rot from the inside out. Salt routes cut across Tartary like quiet veins, linking steppe to city, coast to interior. And along these routes you sense wealth accumulating silently, not in vaults but in obligations. If a town depends on your salt, it will forgive much. If a kingdom depends on it, it will listen. You realize something unsettling. The greatest fortunes are not loud. They are patient. They grow the way stalactites grow, drop by drop, year after year, unnoticed, until they are enormous. Tartarian elites understood time differently. They were not chasing conquest, they were cultivating dependency. And dependency, once established, does not need enforcement. It polices itself. You drift along caravan roads that never fully appear on maps. These roads are remembered instead by rhythms, how long a camel can walk, where water must be found, when snow closes the passes. Knowledge of these rhythms becomes power, and the families who memorize them, who record them in ledgers rather than songs, slowly separate themselves from everyone else. Here, wealth stops looking like coins and starts looking like coordination. You picture warehouses that never display their contents openly. You imagine contracts written in languages only a few can read, binding distant producers to distant consumers who will never meet. You begin to feel how money, at its highest level, stops being tangible at all. It becomes trust, or fear, or habit. The Tartarian elites, as the murmurs suggest, preferred invisibility. They did not build monuments to themselves. They invested in systems that made monuments unnecessary. If grain flows reliably, people do not ask who planned the granaries. If trade continues smoothly, no one questions who set the tariffs. And so, power learned to wear the mask of normalcy. You notice how trade reshapes morality. A town that relies on caravans becomes tolerant, flexible, adaptable, but it also becomes cautious. It learns not to offend those who bring sustenance. Over generations, this caution turns into culture. And culture, once internalized, becomes obedience without force. You ask yourself, was this intentional? Did Tartarian elites consciously design a world where survival itself trained people to comply? Or did they simply notice what worked and repeat it until it hardened into tradition? The story does not accuse, it merely observes. And observation, you sense, can be more unsettling than blame. As your journey continues, you see how wealth begins to separate from labour. Those who move goods no longer need to produce them. Those who count no longer need to touch. A subtle elevation occurs, not upward in towers, but sideways into abstraction. And abstraction is safe. Abstraction cannot be overthrown with pitchforks. You feel the sleepiness deepen as the rhythm of trade lulls you. Day follows day, caravan after caravan. Profit accumulates not in celebration but in sins. The elites who sit at the crossroads do not celebrate their power, they maintain it. Maintenance, you realize, is the true work of dominance. Now you sense how this wealth survives political change. A new ruler may claim the throne, but the grain still needs to move. A new flag may rise, but salt still needs to be taxed. And so the elites remain useful, indispensable, and when power is indispensable, it becomes untouchable. You think of how often history frames collapse as chaos, but here collapse looks more like a reorganization. Tartary fragments, yes, but the trade networks persist, the names change, the languages shift, yet the ledgers remain legible to the same families, the same circles, and suddenly you understand how elites outlive empires. You wonder how many modern fortunes began this way, not with invention, not with brilliance, but with placement, being close to the artery rather than the heart. Because hearts fail, arteries reroute. As your thoughts slow, you notice something else. Wealth like this does not need loyalty. It only needs continuity, and continuity is easier to secure than love. You do not have to inspire anyone, you simply have to be unavoidable. The image of Tartarian elites sharpens briefly, not as villains, not as heroes, but as gardeners of dependency. They prune here, redirect there, ensuring the flow never stops, and in doing so they teach future power classes the same lesson. Never rule loudly when you can rule indispensably. Your breathing evens out as this idea settles. Silk softens, salt dissolves, grain fills the air with a dull, comforting weight, and you feel how wealth, when it is truly ancient, feels less like greed and more like gravity. Always pulling, never seen. You are ready now to move closer to the chambers where this wealth translates into authority. The corridors ahead grow quieter, more formal. Protocol replaces barter, titles replace trust, and as you drift toward those curtain-lined rooms, you carry with you the understanding that before power ever sits on a throne, it learns to sit beside the road. You do not notice when the road ends because it does not end abruptly. It narrows, the dust settles, the noise of caravans fades into a respectful hush. You have arrived not at a battlefield, not at a marketplace, but at a place where footsteps soften on purpose. Curtains hang heavy here, thick enough to swallow sound. This is where courts form, not always royal, not always visible, but powerful all the same. You sense immediately that authority here does not shout, it waits. The Tartarian elites you now encounter are no longer traders or coordinators of flow, they are interpreters. They decide what a rule means. They decide how an agreement is understood. An understanding, you realize, is far more flexible than law itself. You sit quietly at the edge of a chamber lit by low oil lamps. Faces remain calm, almost bored. Nothing dramatic happens. No verdict is announced with a gavel. Instead, glances are exchanged. Pauses stretch slightly longer than necessary, and in those pauses, outcomes are decided. You begin to understand that real courts are not theatres. They are filters. Behind the curtains, you discover power prefers ambiguity. Clear rules invite resistance. Vague customs invite dependence. If no one is entirely sure how a decision will fall, everyone behaves carefully. And careful behaviour repeated over generations becomes obedience without resentment. The Tartarian elites mastered this tone. They spoke in layered language, formal enough to sound authoritative, soft enough to allow retreat. They avoided absolutes. They favoured precedent, and precedent, once established, feels ancient even when it is young. You watch as decisions are justified not because they are right, but because they have been done before. You notice something else unsettling. Access matters more than justice. Who is allowed into the room? Who is permitted to speak? Who is forced to wait outside? These questions determine outcomes long before any argument is heard. And so power shifts from force to procedure. If you control procedure, you control destiny quietly. You imagine how such courts survive political upheaval. A conqueror arrives, a new dynasty claims authority, yet the conqueror still needs advisors, the dynasty still needs legitimacy, and so the same calm figures remain seated behind new curtains, explaining how things are usually done here. Power does not resist conquest, it educates it. As your eyes grow heavier, you see how ritual reinforces authority, the way people stand, the order of greetings, the precise timing of speech. None of it seems important, and that is why it works. Ritual trains the body before the mind ever questions. Bowing comes before belief. Silence comes before consent. You begin to feel how the Tartarian elites refined etiquette into a technology that slows anger, a technology that diffuses urgency. By the time someone realizes they have lost, they are already thanking the room for its wisdom. And gratitude, you realize, is one of power's favorite disguises. You ask yourself softly, where does this still exist today? In offices? In committees? In hearings where decisions feel inevitable long before they are announced? The story does not answer. It simply lets the similarity linger, like a melody you almost recognize. Behind the curtains, records are kept, not of truth, but of alignment. Who complied? Who hesitated? Who must be handled gently next time? These records are not punishments. They are maps of temperament. And temperament, once known, becomes leverage. You feel a strange calm here. Nothing threatens you directly, and that you sense is the danger. Power that terrifies invites rebellion. Power that reassures invites surrender. The Tartarian courts specialized in reassurance. They made authority feel like shelter rather than constraint. Time stretches, generations pass, the curtains change color, the language shifts, but the structure remains. And when Tartary fades as a name, these courts do not collapse, they migrate. They embed themselves into councils, ministries, councils within councils, always polite, always patient. As you drift towards sleep, you realize that courts behind curtains are not relics of the past. They are habits of governance, ways of slowing the world down just enough that decisions can be made without witnesses. You feel the softness of the drapery brush your hand as you step away. Ahead, you sense something colder, more intimate. Family lines, inheritance, names that survive by changing. Blood begins to matter now, and with it, the careful art of becoming invisible while remaining in control. You move onward without ceremony, because bloodlines do not announce themselves. They whisper. They pass quietly through the marriage contracts, through altered spellings, through children taught which questions never to ask. The air feels more intimate now, closer to the skin. Power here is no longer a system you walk through. It is something you're born into, or quietly excluded from. You begin to sense how Tartarian elites learn to survive by becoming fluid. When borders shifted and names like Tartary began to feel dangerous to speak aloud, families did not cling to banners. They let banners go. They understood something elemental. Land can be lost, titles can be revoked, but lineage, if disguised properly, can travel anywhere. You imagine a family seated at a long table. Generations overlap like shadows. The elders speak softly about marriages, not love, about alliances, not friendships. A daughter sent west, a son educated east, names adjusted to fit local tongues. Faiths adopted just convincingly enough. You realize this is not betrayal. It is adaptation refined into art. Bloodlines, you learn, do not need purities to survive. They need continuity. Tartarian elites appear to have understood that identity itself is a garment. You wear what the season demands. Beneath it, the body remains the same. And so, while empires fracture, families persist, threading themselves through new regimes like roots through fresh soil. You notice how genealogy becomes a private language. Charts are kept, stories are remembered selectively, certain ancestors are emphasized, others are quietly forgotten. The past is edited not to deceive outsiders, but to instruct descendants. This is who you are. This is who you never speak of. This is where you must always belong, even if the world insists otherwise. Sleep pulls at you gently as you sense how names function as camouflage. A Tartarian surname becomes Slavic, then Germanic, then Anglicized. With each shift, legitimacy is renewed. No one asks too many questions because the paperwork aligns. And paperwork, you remember, is one of the power's most trusted disguises. You begin to see how nobility transforms into respectability, how aristocracy melts into bourgeois credibility, how yesterday's ruling class becomes today's old family. The language softens, but the advantages remain. education, connections, confidence. These things are inherited just as surely as land once was. You ask yourself almost drowsily, how many modern elites descend not from conquest, but from survival? From knowing when to step forward and when to dissolve into the background. The story does not accuse. It invites you to notice patterns that repeat like lullabies. In Tartarian whispers, bloodlines were never meant to rule openly forever. Open rule attracts resentment. Instead, families positioned themselves as advisors, patrons, benefactors. Always close enough to influence, never close enough to blame. This proximity without visibility becomes a hallmark of hidden power classes. You feel the weight of inheritance not as privilege, but as obligation. Children born into these lines are trained early, not with cruelty but with expectation. You must learn languages. You must read people. You must never be surprised. Surprise, you sense, is the enemy of continuity. As time drifts on, revolutions come and go. Kings fall, republics rise, and yet certain surnames keep appearing not at the front of history books, but in footnotes, in donor lists, in advisory councils. Power learns to move laterally rather than vertically, and lateral movement is harder to detect. Your breathing slows as you realize something quietly unsettling. Bloodlines do not need conspiracy to persist. They only need patience. They only need to teach each generation how to blend, how to belong without standing out. Invisibility becomes inheritance. You imagine Tartarian elites watching the world change with calm eyes. They have seen names erased before. They have learned that survival does not depend on recognition. It depends on placement, and placement once achieved is rarely surrendered willingly. As you drift closer to sleep, you sense the story preparing to turn again. From families to institutions, from inherited memory to trained authority. Ahead wait those who do not inherit power by blood but by knowledge, those who guard calendars, laws, and meanings themselves. The room grows quieter. The table fades. Only the echo of names remains, changing, adapting, enduring. You feel the shift before you see it. Blood fades into ink. Family memory softens into ritual. The power ahead no longer passes through birth alone, but through initiation. You enter the presence of the priest-scholars, the ones who do not rule land or caravans but rule time, meaning, and permission itself. If bloodlines taught elites how to survive, these figures taught them how to endure. You sense immediately that this is quieter ground. Voices are low, movements are economical, words are chosen the way stones are placed in foundations, carefully so nothing collapses later. The Tartarian priest-scholars, as remembered in fragments, do not appear as mystics lost in the clouds. They are administrators of the invisible. They decide when a year begins, what a law truly says, which ritual legitimizes which ruler. And legitimacy, you realize, is the softest yet strongest form of power. You watch calendars being adjusted almost imperceptibly. A festival shifts a few days, a tax deadline moves with it. A planting season is reinterpreted. No one resists because it feels natural. Time itself seems to agree, and that is the secret. You do not fight those who control clocks. You adapt to them. These elites understand that humans live inside stories structured by cycles, weeks, months, holy days, and legal terms. If you control the rhythm, you control expectation. And expectation governs behavior more effectively than force ever could. The Tartarian priest-scholars do not command obedience. They choreograph it. You feel drowsy as you realize how law becomes ritual and ritual becomes unquestionable. A rule repeated often enough no longer feels like a rule. It feels like reality. You're not obeying, you're participating. And participation, once internalized, feels voluntary even when it is not. Here, education becomes the gateway. Not everyone is allowed to learn the deeper meanings. Texts are layered. Public versions soothe, private versions instruct. And those admitted into the inner circles are not always noble by blood, but once admitted, they are bound by secrecy stronger than inheritance. Knowledge becomes a leash made of silk. You notice how priest-scholars survive regime change effortlessly. A new ruler arrives, loud and certain. He needs legitimacy. He needs the calendar to bless him, the law to recognize him, the ritual to crown him. And so he bows, perhaps without realizing it, to those who define what blessing even means. Power kneels to meaning every time. Your thoughts drift as you see how these figures rarely appear in stories as villains. They are too calm for that, too reasonable. They speak of order, harmony, continuity, And none of these are lies. They are simply incomplete truths. Order for whom? Harmony at whose expense? Continuity of what exactly? You sense how Tartarian elites blended scholarship and spirituality not to enlighten the masses, but to stabilize them. When people believe the structure of the world is sacred, they stop imagining alternatives, and imagination, you realize, is the most dangerous resource of all. As time passes, these priest-scholars fracture into professions: lawyers, clerks, academics, clergy. Each inherits a fragment of the same authority. Together, they maintain the illusion that systems arise naturally, rather than being designed. Design disappears behind tradition. You ask yourself quietly, almost sleepily, how often do you check the clock without questioning who set it? How often do you accept a rule because it has always been there? The story does not accuse you. It sits beside you, gently pointing. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as the priest-scholars fade into institutions. Universities, courts, registries, all calm, all reasonable, all indispensable. And like the Tartarian elites before them, they rarely need to enforce, they simply define. As you drift onward, the sound of turning pages replaces voices. You're being drawn toward rooms filled with shelves and locks. Knowledge is about to become something else, not sacred, not communal, but owned. The last thing you feel before moving on is a quiet certainty. Those who control meaning never need to control armies. Armies march to meanings they did not create. You step forward and the air cools, not with wind, but with scene and silence. This is not the silence of absence, it is the silence of containment. Shelves rise around you, heavy with volumes that smell of dust, glue, and patience. Lamps glow softly, their light carefully limited, as if brightness itself might damage what rests here. You have entered the domain of libraries, ledgers, and locked rooms, where knowledge stops being shared and starts being managed. You feel it immediately. This place is not about learning in the joyful sense, it is about custody, about deciding who may know, when and how much. The Tartarian elites understood something subtle and unsettling, that information when abundant creates questions, but when scarce creates obedience. So they did not destroy knowledge, they sorted it. You drift past shelves where texts are categorized not by truth but by risk. Some books are copied endlessly, simplified, softened. Others are sealed, referenced only indirectly, their titles whispered, as if they might wake something dangerous. And you begin to understand that censorship is not always removal. Sometimes it is burial under excess. Sometimes it is delay. Sometimes it is access that requires permission few will ever receive. Ledgers lie open on long tables, their pages filled with careful columns, names, quantities, dates, transactions. At first glance they seem mundane, but you sense how these ledgers quietly replace memory. What is written becomes real, what is not written fades, and so power shifts again, from those who act to those who record. You feel sleep tug at you as you notice how records outlive people. A person dies, but their entry remains. A land changes hands, but the ledger remembers who owed whom. Over time, reality bends toward the written word. Disputes are settled not by experience but by reference, and reference, once centralized, becomes authority. The Tartarian elites, according to the murmurs, did not trust memory alone. Memory argues, memory forgets, ink does neither. So they built systems where paper spoke louder than people. And once this habit spread, even rulers became dependent on clerks. The hand that writes quietly guides the hand that rules. You wander deeper and notice locked rooms within locked rooms. These are not prisons. No one is punished here. Instead, ideas are isolated. Certain maps, certain calculations, certain histories, not destroyed, just postponed indefinitely. You sense how postponement can be more effective than prohibition. What is delayed long enough is eventually forgotten. You begin to see how elites reproduce themselves through documentation. If you control admission records, you control who belongs. If you control credentials, you control who may speak with authority. And if you control archives, you control what future generations believe was possible. Your breathing slows as you recognize how modern this feels. Databases, files, permissions, passwords. The language has changed, but the posture is identical. Knowledge sits behind desks, behind counters, behind interfaces that appear neutral. Yet neutrality, you realize, is simply power, that has learned to look calm. The Tartarian elites did not fear rebellion from the masses here. They feared confusion among themselves, so records were standardized, procedures harmonized, variants eliminated. In doing so, they created continuity that could survive collapse. Even if cities burned, someone could rebuild using the files. You feel a strange comfort in this order, and that realization startles you. Order soothes, it promises stability, and that is why people rarely question who designed it. Chaos feels dangerous, archives feel safe, and safety, you sense, is another word power uses when it wants to be trusted. As you prepare to leave this place, you understand something quietly profound. Libraries and ledgers are not passive. They are active participants in governance. They decide what can be known, what can be proven, and what can be imagined. And imagination, once constrained, rarely escapes its container. The shelves begin to fade, the locks soften. Ahead, you sense movement again, not of people, but of structures. Roads, canals, cities designed like diagrams. You are being drawn toward a different kind of control, one built into stone and water, where obedience is engineered rather than requested. You emerge from the quiet of the archives into open air, yet the openness is deceptive. The sky feels measured, the ground feels intentional. You're walking through spaces that guide your body without ever touching it. This is the invisible city, the realm of engineers, planners, and builders who never call themselves rulers, yet quietly decide how millions will live, move, and obey. You notice the roads first. They are wide enough to allow passage, but narrow enough to control speed. They curve gently, discouraging haste. Intersections appear where attention must slow. None of this feels oppressive. In fact, it feels reasonable. And that, you realize, is the brilliance of it. When design feels reasonable, resistance feels childish. The Tartarian elites who mastered this art did not think in terms of domination. They thought in terms of flow. Water must arrive here. People must pass there. Goods must converge at this point. Once these flows are set, behavior follows naturally. No decree is needed. The city itself persuades. You walk beside canals whose gradients are almost imperceptible. Water moves steadily, obediently, never questioning its path. Towns spring up where the water arrives, not by coincidence but by calculation. Control the canal, and you control life. But the canal never looks like a weapon. It looks like a gift. You feel your thoughts slow as you recognize how architecture trains the body. Stairs humble, gates delay, squares gather, corridors narrow choice. Over time, people stop imagining alternative paths. They walk where walking feels easiest. And ease, you sense, is the most underestimated tool of power. The Tartarian engineers, according to lingering accounts, were revered not as rulers but as problem solvers. They brought order where there was chaos. They drained marshes. They aligned streets. They standardized measurements, and in doing so they embedded authority into stone. Once authority is embedded, it no longer needs defending. You imagine how this survives political change. A flag changes, a government collapses, yet the roads remain, the city grid remains, the water still flows where it was told to flow centuries ago. People adapt to new leaders, but they still live inside old designs. And design, you realize, outlasts ideology. Your eyelids grow heavier as you notice how invisible this power feels. No one thanks the planner. No one curses the gradient. They simply live within it. And because it feels neutral, it is rarely questioned. The city becomes a teacher whose lessons are absorbed without awareness. You begin to see how infrastructure creates habits. Habits create culture. Culture creates consent. By the time someone wonders why things are the way they are, the answer feels too large to confront. This is not tyranny. It is momentum. The Tartarian elites who shaped these systems did not need loyalty. They needed predictability. If people move as expected, behave as expected, consume as expected, governance becomes almost unnecessary. The system governs itself. And self-governing systems are the dream of every hidden power class. You think of modern parallels, commutes, zoning networks, grids. How much of your day is chosen for you before you wake? How often do you mistake convenience for freedom? The questions drift through your mind like slow-moving clouds, unthreatening yet persistent. As night deepens, the city softens. Lights dim. The The geometry remains. You feel small within it, not oppressed, just guided. And that subtle distinction stays with you. Guidance feels caring, control feels cruel, but sometimes they are built from the same blueprint. Ahead, you sense another transformation. Infrastructure gives way to abstraction. Stone becomes numbers. Flow becomes obligation. You are moving towards something lighter, quieter, and harder to escape. Coin, debt, and the gentle chains that bind without ever tightening. You do not hear the chains at first because they do not clink or drag. They do not scrape against stone. They arrive as promises, as conveniences, as relief. Coin glints softly in the lamplight, warm and reassuring, and you feel how easily trust gathers around it. This is where power becomes almost weightless, where obligation floats gently from hand to hand until no one remembers who first held it. The Tartarian elites understood coin not as metal, but as agreement, a shared belief that something stands in for effort, time, and survival. Once that belief is stored, the object itself becomes irrelevant, and so money begins its slow journey from substance to symbol, from something you can feel to something you merely accept. You sense how debt enters quietly, never demanding, always offering. Take this now, pay later. The tone is kind, almost parental, and once the agreement is made, no force is required. The obligation lives inside the mind. You wake up thinking about it. You plan around it. You shape your future to satisfy it. The chain does not pull. You walk with it willingly. You feel drowsy as you realize how this system favors those who already have patience. Tartarian elites could wait. They did not need immediate repayment. Time worked for them. Interest, both spoken and unspoken, accumulated gently, invisibly. A missed season, a poor harvest, a delayed caravan. Each setback tightened the bond, not through cruelty but through inevitability. You notice how debt rearranges relationships. A neighbor becomes a debtor becomes cautious, caution becomes deference, and deference, repeated often enough, becomes hierarchy. No swords are drawn, no voices raised. The structure builds itself from gratitude and fear blended so thoroughly they cannot be separated. Coin circulates faster than goods ever could. It slips across borders even when people cannot. And those who control its issuance, its purity, its acceptance, these figures begin to feel less like merchants and more like arbiters of reality. If your coin is accepted, you exist. If it is refused, you fade. The Tartarian elites, as the murmurs suggest, learn to sit at this threshold. They position themselves where value was defined, where weights were standardized, where trust was certified. Once there, they no longer needed land or titles. They had something better, the power to decide what counted. You feel a gentle heaviness in your chest as you recognize how debt changes time itself. The future becomes pre-owned. Your labor tomorrow is already spoken for, and when enough futures are owned, the present becomes manageable. People focus on meeting obligations rather than imagining alternatives. Sleep pulls closer as you see how this persists across eras. Kings fall, empires fracture, but debts remain. They are honored by successors who never sign them, enforced by systems that feel neutral and fair, and fairness, you sense, is another word that power uses carefully. You ask yourself softly, when did obligation replace obedience? When did numbers begin to govern more effectively than laws? The story does not answer directly. It lets the question settle, like dust on a ledger. As the coin dims and the chains dissolve back into air, you feel yourself being guided onward. Language begins to matter more now. Words, titles, seals. The way a person is addressed starts to shape what they are allowed to become. You drift toward the next chamber, where power speaks in honorifics and listens for obedience hidden inside respect. You notice the shift the moment you hear your name spoken differently. Not louder, not harsher, simply wrapped in a new word, a title, and suddenly the room feels altered. Shoulders adjust, distance changes. Respect appears not because anything about you has changed, but because language has placed you somewhere new. This is where power learns to live inside words. The Tartarian elites understood titles as tools, lightweight, portable, endlessly reusable. A sword must be carried, a crown must be guarded, but a title floats effortlessly from mouth to mouth, shaping behavior wherever it lands. Once spoken often enough, it becomes real. Once believed, it becomes unchallengeable. You feel how titles soften authority. Instead of commands, there are roles. Instead of force, there is expectation. If someone is called an advisor, you listen. If someone is called a custodian, you trust. If someone is called a benefactor, you feel gratitude before you even know why. The word arrives before the action and prepares your response in advance. You drift through halls where seals press into wax with gentle finality. No argument, no explanation, just a mark that signifies alignment with an unseen hierarchy. You sense how symbols replace presence. The person need not be there. The seal speaks for them. And once symbols speak, power can act at a distance. The Tartarian elites refined this language carefully. They avoided words that sounded violent. They preferred words that sounded necessary. Stewardship, mandate, oversight. Each carries a quiet assumption. Someone must be in charge. Someone must decide. And once that assumption is accepted, the only remaining question is who. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as you realize how titles shape self-identity. A person begins to behave as their title expects. Responsibility narrows imagination. Honor becomes a cage lined with velvet. And because it feels dignified, no one complains. You ask yourself, gently, how many limits in your life arrive disguised as respect? How often does authority wear politeness so convincingly that it feels rude to question it? The questions float by without urgency, like thoughts just before sleep. In Tartarian systems, titles outlived people. A person died, but the office remained. And whoever stepped into it inherited not just responsibility, but deference, already prepared by language. Power became recyclable, efficient, eternal. As you move on, the words begin to fade into smoke, but their effects remain. Ahead you sense classrooms, treaties, and agreements written to sound fair while hiding imbalance. The story continues, carrying you deeper into the structures that decide who speaks, who listens, and who is never invited into the room at all. You enter the room quietly, almost without realizing it is a room at all. It feels familiar, orderly, safe, rows align, light falls evenly. This is not a throne room, not an archive, not a court behind curtains. This is a classroom. And you sense immediately that what happens here lasts longer than any decree ever could. The Tartarian elites understood this place deeply. If courts decide disputes and engineers shape movement, schools shape the dream itself. They decide what a child believes the world is, long before the child ever thinks to ask what it could be. And once a belief settles early, it rarely needs defending later. You sit at a small wooden desk. Though your body feels older than the room, words are spoken gently, stories are told with confidence, and certain dates are emphasized, certain questions are redirected. Nothing feels false, nothing feels aggressive. And that is precisely why it works. The most powerful lessons never announce themselves as lessons. You feel your thoughts slow as repetition sets in, the same narratives again and again, heroes framed simply, villains flattened. Complex systems reduced to tidy arcs. It feels comforting, predictable, and predictability, you realize, is a form of rest. When the mind rests, it stops wandering. The Tartarian elites did not need to invent lies. They only needed to trim, to simplify, to remove the parts that encouraged comparison, curiosity, or uncomfortable continuity. What is removed leaves no trace. A child cannot miss what they never knew existed. You notice how authority in this room is not enforced, but assumed. The teacher speaks. You listen. Not because of fear, but because that is how the room is designed to work. Desks face one direction. Time is segmented into bells. Curiosity is rewarded only when it stays within acceptable bounds. Outside those bounds, silence descends. Not punishment, just absence of encouragement. You feel sleep edging closer as you sense how education becomes habit. Habit becomes worldview. Worldview becomes destiny. By the time someone grows old enough to question, the questions feel exhausting. They require unlearning. And unlearning feels dangerous, like stepping off a well-lit path into darkness. The Tartarian elites, according to the echoes, invested heavily here, not always with money, but with influence. Curricula, standards, approved texts, examinations that reward memory over synthesis. Over time, the system begins to reproduce itself. Those who succeed become the next teachers, the next clerks, the next administrators. Continuity achieved without command. You notice how schooling teaches obedience to abstraction. Grades, scores, rankings, invisible measures that feel objective and fair. Yet these measures decide futures quietly. And because they appear neutral, no one asks who designed them or why. You ask yourself softly, how much of what you believe was chosen for you before you were capable of choosing at all? The question does not accuse, it comforts, because if beliefs were given gently, they can be held gently too. As the classroom fades, you sense its echoes everywhere. Training programs, onboarding sessions, professional standards. Learning never really ends, it just becomes more polite. And through it all, the same pattern persists. Shape the mind early, and the body will follow later. You rise from the desk without a sound. Ahead, the walls thin into paper. Ink replaces chalk. You are moving towards rooms where words bind nations, where signatures outweigh armies, and where power hides inside of agreements written to be read but not truly seen. You barely notice when the classroom dissolves into parchment. The desks flatten. The chalk dust settles into ink. You are standing now in a quieter, more formal space, where words no longer teach children, they bind worlds. This is the domain of diplomats, envoys, and negotiators, where power never raises its voice and rarely shows its hand. You feel the atmosphere change immediately. The air is heavier with restraint. Every sentence moves slowly, carefully, as if walking across thin ice. Nothing is said directly if it can be implied. Nothing is promised if it can be postponed. This is where Tartarian elites learn to turn language into fog, thick enough to obscure intention, thin enough to seem transparent. You sit beside a long table. Candles flicker. Quills hover above parchment. Treaties are drafted with exquisite balance, every word weighed, every comma considered. And you begin to understand something quietly unsettling. Agreements are not written to be clear. They are written to be survivable. You notice how ambiguity is cultivated deliberately. Phrases that mean one thing now and another later. Clauses that depend on interpretations yet to be defined. Obligations framed as intentions. Rights paired with conditions so flexible they bend without breaking. No one protests. Everyone nods. The document feels reasonable. Fair even. The Tartarian elites understood that force creates enemies, but uncertainty creates dependence. If the meaning of an agreement must always be interpreted, then interpreters become indispensable. And those who supply interpretation quietly inherit authority without ever claiming it. You feel sleepiness deepen as you realize how diplomacy trains patience. Decisions stretch across years. Consequences are delayed. By the time harm becomes visible, responsibility is diffused. No one person caused it. No one clause alone can be blamed. Power dissolves itself into process. You watch signatures appear, elegant, confident. Wax seals pressed down gently. The agreement is complete, and yet nothing has truly been decided. Instead, a framework has been built, one that will quietly favour those who understand it best. And understanding, as always, is unequally distributed. You sense how Tartarian methods persist here. Elites do not demand victory. They design outcomes. They ensure that no matter how events unfold, interpretation flows back toward them. Win or lose, they remain necessary. The lullaby rhythm carries you as you think of modern parallels. International organizations, trade agreements, regulatory bodies, structures that promise cooperation while quietly centralizing authority. You do not feel anger, only recognition. Recognition has a way of calming the mind even when the truth it reveals is unsettling. You ask yourself gently, how many conflicts are managed rather than resolved? How often is peace simply another word for postponement? The questions drift like smoke, unanswered and unchallenged. As the candles dim, the diplomats fade into silhouettes. The parchment rolls itself closed. Ahead you sense whispers again, rumours of circles within circles, of groups that gather not to negotiate publicly but to align privately. The story draws you onward, deeper into the soft shadows where secrecy begins to feel like comfort rather than threat. You do not enter this place so much as you are gradually included. There is no doorway, no announcement, no moment where secrecy feels dramatic. Instead, it feels familiar, comfortable, like a room you have always known existed but were never invited to mention. This is where circles form, quietly, patiently, where Tartarian patterns of power learn to survive without names. You notice first how ordinary everything appears: chairs, tables, gentle laughter, polite conversation. Nothing here looks dangerous, and that you sense is intentional. Power that wishes to remain hidden must first appear harmless. The Tartarian elites understood that secrecy works best when it feels voluntary, even cozy. You feel how belonging is offered slowly, not demanded, not earned through conquest. Instead, it is suggested through recognition, a nod, a shared reference, a subtle test of discretion. Say nothing and you pass. Ask too much and the moment evaporates. Secrecy, you realize, is not enforced here. It is curated. You sense how these circles form around shared understanding rather than shared goals. No manifesto, no grand plan, just alignment. A mutual awareness of how the world actually works beneath its official stories. And once that awareness is shared, cooperation becomes effortless. There is no need to conspire when everyone already knows which direction to lean. The Tartarian elites refined this approach over generations. Open power attracts attention. Hidden power attracts loyalty. People cherish what feels exclusive, they protect it, they internalize its rules, and so secrecy becomes self-maintaining, passed down not through orders but through culture. You feel your eyelids grow heavy as you notice how symbols operate here. Not as commands, but as signals, a gesture, a phrase, a shared joke that only works if you understand a certain history. Symbols create boundaries without walls, they separate without confrontation, and those outside rarely notice the separation at all. You begin to see how public faces and private alignments diverge. A person may argue fiercely in daylight, then dine calmly at night. The contradiction does not trouble them. They understand the difference between theatre and structure. The Tartarian method lives here most clearly. Allow conflict on the surface, preserve alignment underneath. You ask yourself softly, how many disagreements are permitted because they do not threaten the deeper order? How often is dissent managed rather than suppressed? The questions drift without urgency, like thoughts that come just before sleep. You sense how these circles offer something deeply human: certainty, a feeling of being inside rather than outside. And once someone feels inside, they rarely risk exile by speaking openly. Silence becomes loyalty. Discretion becomes virtue. As time passes, these circles multiply. They adapt, they rename themselves. Lodges, clubs, committees, foundations, always respectable, always benign, always just one step removed from decision-making, yet somehow always present when decisions are shaped. You feel no fear here, only calm, and that calm unsettles you more than threat ever could, because it suggests that power no longer needs to hide aggressively. It simply needs to feel familiar. As you drift onward, the room fades into records again. Lists, registries, classifications. Secrecy gives way to observation. You are being carried toward a system that does not merely align people but tracks them, counts them, watches them quietly, forever learning. You feel the change not as fear but as attention, a subtle pressure like being gently noticed, not watched in a dramatic way, no eyes, no shadows, but registered, counted, placed. This is where the story shifts again, from secrecy to observation, from alignment to awareness. You are entering the inheritance of surveillance. The Tartarian elites, as the echoes suggest, did not begin with watching. They began with counting people, counting animals, counting fields, counting days. At first it feels harmless, practical even. How else can a society function without knowing what it has? And so the census is born, not as a tool of control, but as a promise of order. You feel sleep pulling at you as you imagine clerks moving calmly from town to town, recording names with steady hands. Nothing invasive, nothing threatening, just questions. Who lives here? How many mouths? How much land? The answers feel ordinary. Yet once written, they become permanent. And permanence, you sense, is where power begins to harden. You notice how records slowly begin to follow people rather than places. A name is no longer just spoken, it is filed. A birth is no longer just celebrated, it is registered. Identity shifts from something lived to something documented. And once identity is documented, it can be referenced, compared, corrected. The Tartarian elites understood this shift deeply. Surveillance does not begin with suspicion, it begins with administration. If you wish to govern gently, you must first know gently, and once knowledge accumulates, patterns emerge. Who moves often, who stays, who complies quickly, who delays. You feel how classification replaces judgment. People are sorted not as good or bad, but as types. Occupations, regions, faiths, languages, categories that feel neutral, even scientific. But categories create distance, and distance makes control easier, quieter, less personal. As your thoughts slow, you sense how paperwork becomes a mirror. People learn to trust more than themselves. If the record says it, it must be true. If this document denies it, it must be wrong. Lived experience begins to lose authority to written confirmation. Reality defers to the file. You notice how this system outlives every ruler. Kings die, councils dissolve, but registries persist. They are inherited by whoever comes next, ready to be used without needing to be rebuilt. Surveillance, once established, is never truly dismantled. It is only rebranded. You ask yourself softly, when did being known become safer than being unknown? When did anonymity start to feel suspicious rather than free? The questions float gently, unanswered, as if they are not meant to be solved, only felt. The Tartarian method reveals itself here as patience again. No sudden domination, just accumulation, record by record, year by year, until the world feels legible from above, like a map that updates itself endlessly. You feel no menace, only inevitability. And inevitability is soothing. It allows the mind to rest. Someone is paying attention, someone is keeping track, someone knows, and so responsibility quietly shifts away from the individual, toward the system. As you drift onward, the ledgers thin into symbols again. Observation gives way to design. The counted become arranged. You are being carried toward cities that speak in geometry, toward capitals and cathedrals aligned not by chance but by intention older than memory itself. You feel the ground change beneath your feet, not in texture but in intention. Streets widen, then narrow, sightlines open, then close, towers rise where the eye is meant to lift. This is no longer simple infrastructure. This is choreography. You have entered a space where power speaks through form, where stone and symbol work together in silence. Capitals and cathedrals surround you now, arranged with care that feels older than reason. The Tartarian elites, according to the lingering patterns, understood something deeply human. People look for the meaning in shape, in alignment, in repetition. When buildings echo the sky, when streets point towards sacred centers, when distances feel deliberate rather than accidental, the mind relaxes. It assumes order, and order, once assumed, invites trust. You walk through a city laid out like a diagram. From above, it would look intentional, grids intersecting with circles, axes pointing toward monuments that seem to pull attention like gravity. You feel how your body responds without being asked. You slow near wide steps. You lower your voice near tall facades. Architecture teaches etiquette without words. Cathedrals rise not merely as places of worship, but as anchors of orientation. You always know where you are in relation to them. They define center and periphery, sacred and mundane. And once such distinctions are internalized, hierarchy feels natural. Someone must stand at the center, others must orbit. The Tartarian elites embedded authority into these designs carefully. Sacred geometry, whether named or not, whispers that the world is ordered by principles beyond debate. If the city itself reflects cosmic harmony, then those who claim to understand that harmony feel destined to guide it. Questioning them begins to feel like questioning the universe itself. You feel sleep pulling closer as you notice how power disappears into beauty here. No threats, no commands, only awe. Awe lifts the mind upward, away from resistance. And when people are awed, they are open. Open to stories, open to guidance, open to surrender disguised as reverence. You sense how these spaces survive centuries of change. Flags are replaced, statues are renamed, yet the geometry remains. The same streets guide the same movements, the same towers dominate the same horizons. People live inside intentions long forgotten, obeying patterns whose designers are never discussed. You ask yourself quietly, How often do you feel small in such places, and mistake that feeling for humility rather than design? How often does scale convince you of your place before a word is ever spoken? The questions drift gently, like echoes in a vast hall. As night deepens, the city glows softly. Lights trace the same alignments once marked by fire and star. You feel held, oriented, reassured, and you sense how this reassurance is one of power's most enduring gifts. When people feel the world makes sense, they stop asking who arranged it. The geometry begins to fade as you move on. The stone softens into banners, the sacred dissolves into spectacle. Ahead you sense noise again. Crowds, chants, upheaval. The story is preparing to show you how even rebellion can be shaped, how revolutions can be staged without ever touching the deeper structure beneath. The noise reaches you before the meaning does. Shouts, footsteps, the low thunder of many bodies moving together. Banners ripple through the air, bright with promise, heavy with hope. You're standing inside a revolution, or what feels like one. Energy surges, old symbols are torn down, new ones are raised quickly, almost urgently, as if the crowd fears the silence that might follow if it pauses too long. You feel the excitement first. It is contagious. It warms the chest. It convinces you that something real is finally changing. And perhaps it is. But as your breathing slows, you begin to notice something else, something oddly familiar beneath the chaos. The routes the crowds move along, the squares they gather in, the buildings they surround. Even rebellion, you sense, is following a plan it did not design. The Tartarian elites, according to the quiet patterns, learned long ago that power does not always oppose revolution. Sometimes it hosts it. Sometimes it prepares the stage, sets the lighting, and steps politely aside while the performance unfolds. Anger needs space. It needs symbols. It needs an enemy clearly outlined. And when these needs are met, it rarely looks deeper. You watch as statues fall. Names are erased. Flags burn. It feels decisive, cleansing. But beneath it all, the infrastructure remains. The ledgers are untouched. The registries intact. The trade routes uninterrupted. You realize slowly that what is being destroyed is mostly surface. Faces, titles, rituals of authority, while the deeper systems hum on without disturbance. You feel drowsy as you notice how new leaders rise quickly, almost predictably. They speak the language the crowd already knows. They promise fairness, renewal, justice. And soon they require advisors, committees, administrators. The same types of figures step forward, calm, experienced, indispensable. Power flows back into familiar shapes, as naturally as water returns to a channel. The Tartarian method reveals itself here with particular clarity. True elites do not fear upheaval, they anticipate it. They design systems resilient enough to survive it. If anger is inevitable, better to let it exhaust itself against symbols than direct it towards structure. You ask yourself softly, how many revolutions change who speaks, but not how decisions are made? How often does the language of freedom decorate the same old machinery? The questions drift without accusation, like reflections seen in passing. You sense how theatre plays its role. Trials, declarations, public reckonings. These rituals give the feeling of closure. They allow societies to believe a chapter has ended. And belief, you realize, is often more important than reality when it comes to stability. As the crowds thin and night falls, the city grows quiet again. New banners hang where old ones were torn down. The geometry is unchanged. The archives remain locked. The schedules resume, and life continues, slightly rebranded, but structurally familiar. You move away from the square with a gentle heaviness, not despair, not cynicism, just understanding. Understanding that change is real, but layered. That some shifts are allowed, even encouraged, because they protect what lies beneath. Ahead, the world stretches outward. Ships, borders, distant lands. You feel the story preparing to widen its view, to show how power experiments far from its center, testing methods on places easy to rename, easy to forget. You feel the horizon open as you move forward, as if the world itself exhales and stretches. The center fades behind you, its cathedrals, its squares, its revolutions, and ahead lie distances measured not in steps, but in weeks at sea. Ships wait, maps widen, names grow vague. This is where power experiments far from its own reflection, where colonies become laboratories. You sense immediately how different this feels. The rules are lighter here, traditions less fixed, resistance easier to dismiss. The Tartarian elites, in their long memory, understood the value of distance. What could not be attempted at the centre could be tested at the edge, and so the edge became a place of trial, not chaos, but controlled uncertainty. You watch as systems are introduced gently, almost generously, new taxes are framed as improvements, new laws explained as modernisation, new boundaries drawn with confidence, as if they had always been there. The people who live here are told they are being helped, organised, brought into a wider order. And sometimes you sense parts of this are even true. Sleep draws closer as you notice how power behaves when it feels unobserved by its own people. It becomes curious, experimental, less careful with appearances. Methods are refined here, ways of extracting value, managing populations, categorizing difference. Successes are noted, failures are quietly discarded. Nothing is wasted except lives, and those are rarely counted honestly. You feel how distance softens conscience. Decisions made far away feel abstract. Suffering becomes data, a line in a report, and reports, you remember, travel back more easily than empathy. The Tartarian elites, according to the pattern, learn much from these far places, lessons later imported home, polished, and presented as inevitable progress. You notice how narratives are crafted carefully. Colonies are described as backward, chaotic, in need of guidance. This story justifies intervention. It reassures the centre that order is being extended, not imposed. And once that story settles, questioning it begins to feel naive, even disloyal. You ask yourself softly, how often is control tested on those least able to refuse? How many modern systems were perfected where resistance could be ignored? The questions drift without anger, heavy and slow, like waves rolling under moonlight. As time passes, these laboratories yield results. Identification systems, resource management techniques, population controls, administrative habits, all refined far away, then quietly brought back where they are framed as efficiency rather than domination. You feel a gentle chill as you realize how power learns. It does not invent blindly, it studies, it observes, it improves, and distance provides cover for that learning. When harm is remote, improvement feels neutral. The ships fade, the maps fold again. What was once distant now feels close. The methods tested at the edges are returning, normalized, renamed. And as you drift onward, you sense the story preparing to show how even memory itself can be shaped, how longing for a past can be crafted into a tool as effective as any law. You feel the air change again, softer now, warmer, tinged with longing. The sharp edges of control recede, replaced by something more comforting, more familiar. Stories begin to surface, stories of a time when things were better, purer, more balanced. You hear them in quiet conversations, in songs, in carefully framed histories. This is where nostalgia enters, not as memory, but as design. The Tartarian elites, as the patterns suggest, understood the power of the past more deeply than the power of force. The future is uncertain, the present is demanding, but the past, especially a carefully shaped one, asks nothing of you except belief. And belief, you realize, is the easiest thing to govern. You drift through images of a golden age that feels just out of reach. Grand harmony, wise rulers, communities aligned with nature and order. The details are always vague, softened by time. Hard questions are absent. Contradictions smoothed away. What remains is a feeling, not a record. And feelings, you sense, are far more persuasive than facts. Sleep pulls at you as you notice how this nostalgia is deployed. When people grow restless, they are invited to look backward. When systems feel cold, the past is painted as warm, not necessarily truthful, just comforting. The Tartarian method reveals itself again. Do not argue with dissatisfaction, redirect it. You feel how myths are cultivated selectively. Certain achievements are magnified, certain failures forgotten. Heroes are elevated beyond complexity, villains reduced to caricature. The past becomes a story with clear morals designed not to inform but to soothe. And when people are soothed, they stop demanding change. You ask yourself quietly, how often does longing replace understanding? How often does the idea of what was silence the question of what is? The questions drift like half-remembered dreams, present but not urgent. You sense how nostalgia becomes loyalty. If the past was great, then the system that claims descent from it must be preserved. Even if it no longer resembles that past, the association is enough. Symbols are revived, language reused, rituals reenacted. Continuity is implied even when reality has shifted completely. The Tartarian elites, according to the Whispers, learned that memory could be curated just like archives, not erased, reshaped, not denied, romanticized. And once people defend a myth, they defend the structures attached to it. Power no longer needs to justify itself, it only needs to remind. You feel the gentleness of this control. It does not threaten. It reassures. It says, this is how it has always been, even when it has not. And that reassurance feels like rest, like belonging, like sleep. As the golden images fade, you sense a return to the present, but a present reframed by the past. Ahead, you feel the shapes of modern rooms again. Boards, tables, screens. The story is preparing to show you how ancient patterns step into contemporary clothing, how councils and committees echo the same old designs, only quieter. Your thoughts slow, the longing softens, and you drift onward, carrying with you the understanding that sometimes the most powerful chains are woven from memory itself. You return to the present without a jolt, without a clear border between then and now. The past does not end, it simply changes its clothing. The room you enter is clean, well lit, and modestly impressive. A long table, comfortable chairs, glass, wood, quiet confidence. This is where modern boards gather, where decisions are framed as collaborative, rational and unavoidable. You sense immediately how familiar this feels. No crowns, no robes, no incense or banners. And yet the posture is unmistakable. People sit in ordered positions, agendas are followed. Minutes are recorded. Consensus is praised. This is power that has learned to speak softly and dress plainly, echoing ancient patterns beneath contemporary manners. The Tartarian elites, as the rhythm of the story suggests, would recognize this instantly. Councils have always been their preferred shape. A single ruler attracts attention. A group diffuses responsibility. When decisions are made by committees, no one feels personally accountable, yet outcomes still arrive with force. You feel your eyelids grow heavier as you notice how language works here. Words like best practice, oversight, risk mitigation, and stakeholder interest. None sound threatening. All sound sensible, and that is their strength. Power no longer needs to justify itself morally. It presents itself as technical. You watch how disagreement is allowed, but only within boundaries. Questions about implementation are welcomed. Questions about structure feel awkward, almost impolite. The room gently discourages them without ever saying no. Silence does the work. A pause, a redirected topic, and the moment passes. You sense how expertise replaces authority. Those who understand the system best guide it most. Credentials speak louder than conviction. Charts outweigh lived experience. And because expertise feels earned, obedience feels reasonable. You are not submitting, you are deferring. The Tartarian pattern repeats. Keep the structure stable, allow surface variation. Different opinions, different styles, different personalities, all contained within the same framework. The illusion of choice remains intact while outcomes remain consistent. You ask yourself quietly, how often does consensus mean alignment rather than agreement? How often does inclusion serve to legitimize decisions already shaped elsewhere? The questions drift slowly, unthreatening, like thoughts you might have while half asleep. You notice how boards rarely speak of power. They speak of responsibility, stewardship, sustainability. These words soothe, they imply care. And care, you realize, is one of power's most convincing disguises. When authority presents itself as protection, resistance feels reckless. As the meeting concludes, nothing dramatic happens, no announcement, no applause. People stand, exchange pleasantries, leave. And yet the world outside will shift slightly because of what was decided here. Quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. You move away from the table with a sense of calm recognition. Ancient councils once sat in stone halls. Now they sit in glass rooms. The materials have changed, the patterns have not. Ahead, the story grows lighter and faster. Information begins to flow at impossible speeds. Decisions are guided not just by records, but by prediction. You are being carried toward a new kind of elite, one that governs not through lineage or law, but through data itself. You feel the pace change before you fully understand why. The room grows quieter, yet information moves faster. Screens glow softly. Numbers update themselves. Decisions no longer wait for meetings, they anticipate them. This is where the new elite rises, not announced, not crowned, but calculated. You're standing at the edge of the algorithmic aristocracy. The Tartarian elites, if they were watching, would recognize the pattern instantly. The tools are new, but the logic is ancient. Control the flow, predict behavior, shape outcomes before choices feel conscious. Only now the ledgers are alive, and the maps redraw themselves in real time. You feel a gentle pressure as data gathers around you. Not personal, not invasive, just attentive. What you buy, where you pause, what you ignore, each action leaves a trace, and those traces, once aggregated, begin to speak more clearly than words ever could. You're not being judged, you're being modelled. Sleep pulls closer as you realize how prediction replaces command. No one tells you what to do. The system simply learns what you're likely to do next and rearranges the world to meet you there. Options appear, paths are suggested, resistance feels inefficient, almost unnecessary. The Tartarian method repeats itself here with elegant precision. Do not force behavior. Anticipate it, guide it gently, make the preferred choice feel like the obvious one. When people move willingly in the desired direction, power becomes invisible again. You notice how this creates a new hierarchy, not of blood or title, but of access. Those who design models, those who interpret signals, those who own platforms where attention gathers. They rarely appear in public debate. They do not need to. Their influence operates upstream, shaping what debate even becomes possible. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as you see how authority fragments into systems. No single ruler, no clear target. Responsibility dissolves into processes that claim neutrality. If harm occurs, it is described as an error, a miscalculation, an unintended outcome. No one intended it, everyone regrets it, and nothing fundamentally changes. You ask yourself softly, when decisions are automated, who is accountable? When influence is invisible, how does resistance find its shape? The questions float without urgency, like thoughts that do not demand answers before sleep. You sense how behavior itself becomes currency. Attention is harvested, preference is refined, desire is nudged. And those who control these nudges hold a power older than kingship, the power to define what feels normal. Once normal is set, alternatives feel strange, even threatening. The Tartarian elites once controlled calendars, trade routes, and archives. Now their inheritors, or their echoes, control feeds, metrics, and predictive models. The materials have changed, the ambition has not. Stability, continuity, gentle obedience. You feel a strange comfort here. The system seems to know you, to adapt to you, to smooth your path. And comfort, you realize, is the most effective anesthetic. When life feels easy, questioning feels unnecessary. When questioning fades, power rests. As the screens dim, the numbers soften into patterns. You sense that this is nearly the end of the journey. Only one question remains, one that has followed you quietly through every room, every system, every age. Who are you meant to be inside all of this? The answer does not arrive yet. It waits, patiently, just ahead. You arrive at the final chamber without a sense of arrival. There is no doorway, no threshold, no signal that this is the end. It feels instead like a pause. A long, deliberate pause where all the patterns you have seen begin to overlap. Maps, trade, courts, bloodlines, calendars, cities, revolutions, data. They no longer appear as separate rooms, but as layers of the same design, stacked gently atop one another. You feel no urgency here, only a quiet question, steady and patient, waiting for you to notice it. What is your role in all of this? The Tartarian elites, across centuries and transformations, rarely asked people to worship them, obey them, or even recognize them. They asked something far subtler. They asked people to participate, to move where movement felt natural, to accept systems that felt reasonable, to inherit stories that felt comforting, to trust processes that felt neutral. You realize now that hidden power classes are not sustained by villains, but by habits, by routines that lull the mind, by conveniences that soften resistance, by narratives that make the world feel explainable, even when its deepest structures remain unseen. Power does not demand belief. It only asks that you do not look too closely for too long. You feel your breathing slow as you consider how often your life intersects with these patterns. The forms you fill out, the schedules you follow, the screens you scroll, none of these feel oppressive. They feel normal. And normality, you sense, is the final achievement of any enduring system. The Tartarian story, whether literal, symbolic, or somewhere in between, leads you here, not to fear, not to certainty, but to awareness. Awareness that power prefers softness to force, that it survives by adapting rather than confronting, that it flows into whatever shape humans find easiest to live inside. You ask yourself, gently now, without suspicion, does knowing this change anything? Or does it simply add a quiet layer to how you see the world? The story does not push you toward action. It does not demand belief. It sits beside you like a wise old presence, content to let the question breathe. You notice how even questioning power can be absorbed by power, how dissent becomes content, how curiosity becomes data, and yet something remains untouched by systems, the simple act of noticing, of slowing down, of choosing where your attention rests. The Tartarian elites mastered attention long before screens existed. They knew that what you look at repeatedly becomes reality, and what you ignore slowly disappears. Perhaps you think the most radical act is not rebellion, but awareness paired with calm. As the final images soften, the world feels less sharp, less demanding. You're not asked to solve anything tonight, only to hold the thought that history is not just something that happened. It is something that continues, quietly, through structures that feel older than memory and newer than language. And now the pace slows even further. The story loosens its grip. Sentences lengthen, edges blur. The systems you have walked through fade into abstraction, like constellations dissolving into the night sky once you stop naming them. You feel the reassurance return. Whatever power exists, it has always existed. Whatever systems shape the world, they have always shaped it. And yet you are still here, breathing, listening, drifting. You're allowed to rest. Let the maps fold themselves away. Let the ledgers close. Let the screens dim. You do not need answers tonight. You only need sleep. And as your thoughts slow to a gentle whisper, you're reminded of something simple and calming. Awareness does not have to be heavy. It can be light. It can be curious. It can fade gently into dreams. The world will continue its quiet patterns whether you watch them or not. For now, you are safe to let go.